Hello everyone. Today our topic of discussion is impact of war on environment. Plant trees, not bombs. So the contents of discussion today are environmental impact of war, Agent Orange, military and environment, various wars and their environmental impact, what are the effects of war, different environmental laws and organizations which stand at international level. So to start with, what is environmental impact of war? Study of environmental impact of war, because various studies have been done that focuses on the modernization of warfare, that we need new technology for the war and its increasing effects on the environment. Definitely the war has hazardous effects on the environment. However, many methods of modern warfare cause for greater devastation on the environment. We have seen in the Gulf Wars and the Syrian wars. The progression of warfare from the chemical weapons to nuclear weapons. We have discussed about the hazardous effects of nuclear weapons on the environment and the nuclear issues in our recent lecture, which has increasingly created stress on ecosystems and the environment. Specific examples we all know which have had their environmental impact of war, they include the World War I, II, Vietnam War, the Rwandan Civil War, Kosovo War and the Gulf War. So here we will discuss little bit about the Vietnam, Rwanda and the environmental issues regarding these wars. So the war had significant environmental implication by the use of chemical agents, because lot of chemicals are used in these wars to destroy the military significant vegetation. So enemies found an advantage in remaining invisible by blending into civilian population or by taking cover in dense vegetation, and opposing armies targeted natural ecosystems. So they all destroyed the natural ecosystems which existed. Here I will give you some examples. For example, the US military, they used more than 20 million gallons of herbicides. They were sprayed by the US to defoliate forest, clear growth along the borders of the military sites and eliminate enemy crops. And the chemical agents gave the United States an advantage in the wartime efforts also. However, the vegetation was unable to regenerate and left behind bare mud flats even years after spraying. So you see how these people use the chemicals and the weapons to destroy the vegetations of the enemy land. And not only was the vegetation affected, but also the wildlife. Now talking about the Rwanda genocide. It led to the killing of roughly 8 lakh Tutsis and moderate Hutus. So in Rwanda genocide, there was a conflict between Tutsis and Hutus. So a lot of killings have been seen during this period, during this genocide. The war created a massive migration of nearly 2 million Hutus fleeing Rwanda over the course of just a few weeks of refugee camps in Tanzania and now modern day Democratic Republic of Congo. Now this large displacement of people in refugee camps put pressure on the surrounding ecosystem. So ultimately your ecosystem is affected. Forests were cleared in order to provide wood for building shelters and creating cooking fires. These people suffered from harsh conditions and they constituted an important threat impact to natural resources. Now, the consequences from the conflict also included your degradation of the national parks and reserves. So, suppose, just for example, if a war is taking place in this area, so population is likely to migrate to the new areas, disturbing the ecosystem. More resources are needed now in this area to help those migrated people. The population crash in Rwanda, it shifted personnel and capital to other parts of the country, making it hard to protect the wildlife also. So your ecosystem is disturbed, the population is disturbed, your wildlife is also disturbed during such kind of wars. So more broadly, throughout Africa, war has been a major factor in the decline of wildlife populations inside the natural parks, the national parks, and other protected areas. So specifically here again we will talk about the World War II also. World War II, it drove vast increase in production, militarized the production and transportation of commodity while introducing many new environmental consequences. So there were a lot of environmental hazards also which can still be seen today. We will talk about them. World War II was wide-ranging in its humans, animals and material destruction. The post-war effects on World War II, both ecological, social, are still visible decades after the conflict. So now what happened during World War II? New technology was used to create aircraft which were used in air raids. Aircrafts during war were used for transporting resources from different military bases and dropping bombs on enemy, neutral and friendly targets alike. So these activities, they damaged the environmental habitats. So this happened during the course of your airstrikes. Now similar to wildlife, ecosystem also suffer from the production of noise pollution. So these aircrafts, they produce lot of noise pollution also from military aircrafts. And during World War II, aircraft acted as a vector for transportation of exotics, whereby weeds and cultivated species are brought to oceanic island systems by way of aircraft landing strips using refueling, stagnation station, etc. So invasive species were also introduced at various places. Now, as you all know, when the atomic bomb was dropped, it released enormous quantity of energy and radioactive particles. The radioactive particles released contaminated the land and water miles away also. The initial blast increased the surface temperature. So firstly, when the atomic bomb was exploded, it increased the surface temperature. Along with the crushing winds caused by the initial blast, trees and buildings in the path were all destroyed. So in the path of those winds, whatever come, it was destroyed. Now, European forests experienced traumatic impacts from the fighting during the war. Behind the combat zones, timber from cut down trees to clear up the path for fighting. The shattered forest in the battle zones faced exploitation. So the use of heavily hazardous chemicals was first initiated during your World War II. Now, talking about the marine ecosystems during World War II. Marine ecosystems were totally damaged, not only from the chemical contaminants but also from wreckage from the naval ships which leaked oil into the water. So oil contamination in the Atlantic Ocean due to World War II shipwrecks is estimated at over 15 million tons. So these oil spills are difficult to clean up and take many years to clean. So to this day, traces of oil can still be found in the Atlantic Ocean from the naval shipwrecks which happened during World War II. So the use of these chemicals during war, they helped increase the scale of chemical industries and helped show the government the value of scientific research to the government. Now talking about once again the environmental impacts of World War II were very drastic, which allowed them to be seen in the Cold War, and they can be seen today also. The impacts of those conflict, chemical contamination and aerial warfare, they all contribute to reduction in the population of global flora and fauna, as well as they reduce the species diversity also. Now talking in brief about the Gulf War. During 1991 Gulf War, the Kuwaiti oil fires were a result of scorched earth policy of Iraqi military forces retreating from Kuwait in 1991 after conquering the country but being driven out by coalition military forces. Then what happened? The Gulf War oil spill, regarded as the worst oil spill in the history, was caused when Iraqi forces opened valves at the Sea Island oil terminal and dumped oil from several tankers into the Persian Gulf. Some American military personnel complained the Gulf War syndrome typified by symptoms including immune system disorders and birth defects in their children, whether it is due to time spent in active service during the war or for other reasons, remains very controversial. Now we will talk about the environmental hazards that take place during such wars. See, resources are a key source of conflict between nations. After the end of Cold War in particular, many have suggested that environmental degradation will increase scarcities and become an additional source of armed conflict. A nation's survival depends upon its sources from the environment. So resources that are source of armed conflict include your territory, strategic raw materials, sources of energy, water and food. So we have to maintain the resource stability, chemical and nuclear warfare by the nations. But during these wars, a lot of chemical agents were also used. They were employed during World War I and World War II. For example, nerve gas. Nerve gas, also known as organophosphorus, it was used as lethal levels. So they used this gas at lethal levels that others should die against human beings, and it destroyed a number of non-human vertebrate and invertebrate populations. However, contaminated vegetation would mostly be spared and would only pose a threat to herbivores. The result of innovations in chemical warfare led to a broad range of different chemicals for war and domestic use, but it also resulted in unforeseen environmental damages to the ecosystem. Now, the progression of this particular warfare and its effect on the environment, it continued with the invention of weapons of mass destruction. So what are the weapons of mass destruction? The nuclear weapons. While today weapons of mass destruction act as deterrents, and the use of weapons of mass destruction during World War II created significant environmental destruction. On top of it, the great loss of human life, natural resources are usually the first to suffer. So whatever happened, natural resources, they always suffered first. Nuclear warfare imposes both direct and indirect effects on the environment. The physical direct destruction due to blast or by biospheric damage due to ionizing radiation or radiotoxicity directly affect the ecosystems. Now we will talk about the Agent Orange. You might have heard about it. Agent Orange was one of the herbicides and defoliants which was used by British military during Malian emergency and the US military in the herbicidal warfare program Operation Ranch Hand during the Vietnam War. Due to Agent Orange, it resulted in 4 lakh deaths and disabilities and 5 lakh children born with birth defects. Many Commonwealth personnel who handled or used Agent Orange during the decades after 1948 and 1960, they suffered from serious exposure to dioxin. Agent Orange also caused major soil erosion to areas in Malaya. An estimated 10,000 civilians and possibly insurgents in Malaya also suffered heavily from defoliant effects, though many historians likely agreed it was more than 10,000 given the Agent Orange was used on a large scale in Malayan conflict, and unlike the US, the British government manipulated the numbers and kept its secret very tight in fear of negative world public opinion. So Agent Orange existed in our history, which was used in the wartime, and it had detrimental effects on the environment. Now, talking about the militarism and the environment, military and environment, human security has traditionally been solely linked to military activities and defense. Scholars in institutions like International Peace Bureau are now increasingly calling for more holistic approach to security, particularly including an emphasis on the interconnections and interdependencies that exist between the humans and the environment. So military activity has significant impacts on the environment now. They are planting trees, they are taking care of the ecosystem and the environment also. Not only can war be destructive to the socio-environment, but military activities produce extensive amounts of greenhouse gases also that contribute to anthropogenic climate change, pollution, and cause resource depletion among other environmental impacts. So that is why the military these days is taking care of the environment, because they know their activities are harming the environment somewhere. Now, talking about greenhouse gas and emissions and pollution, several studies have found a strong positive correlation between military spending and increased greenhouse gas emissions, with the impact of military spending on carbon emission being more pronounced for countries of the global north. See, US military is estimated to be #1 fossil fuel consumer in the world. Additionally, your military activities involve high emissions of pollution also. US military is also considered one of the largest generators of pollution in the world. Combined top 5 US chemical companies only produce 1/5 of the toxins produced by the Pentagon. In Canada, the Department of National Defense readily admits it is the largest energy consumer of the Government of Canada and a consumer of high volumes of hazardous materials. Now, military pollution is a worldwide occurrence. Armed forces from around the world were responsible for the emission of 2/3 of chlorofluorocarbons that were banned in 1987 Montreal Protocol for causing damage to ozone layer. In addition, naval accidents during the Cold War have dropped at minimum 50 nuclear warheads and 11 nuclear reactors into the ocean. They remain on the ocean floor. So this is really sad to know. Now, talking about the effects on the land and resource use. So military land use needs such as bases, training, storage, etc. often displace people from their lands and homes. Military activity uses solvents, fuels, other toxic chemicals which can leach toxins into the environment, which is in fact happening, that remain there for the decades and even centuries. So military caused noise pollution can also diminish the quality of life of the nearby communities as well as their ability to rear and hunt animals to support themselves. Now, militaries are also highly resource intensive. Weapons and military equipment make up second largest international trade sector. The International Peace Bureau says that more than 50% of helicopters in the world are for military use, and approximately 25% of jet fuel consumption is by military vehicles. So these vehicles are also extremely inefficient, carbon intensive, and discharge emissions that are more toxic than those of other vehicles. So you can see what kind of harm they are causing to the land and the resources meant for good environment. Now, there are many activist responses for the environment. Activists point to social issues such as extreme poverty and advocate for much funding to redirect from military expenses to these causes. So, military is trying to have positive effects on the environment. They are doing their work. For example, there are examples from around the world of nations, armed forces aiding in land management and conservation. They are trying to make up for their earlier losses. For example, Bhuj, India, military forces stationed there helped to reforest the area. In Venezuela, it is part of National Guard's responsibility to protect the natural resources also. So, major environmental issues are being addressed by the military also. Finally, there are certain military technologies like GPS and drones are helping environmental scientists and conservationist ecologists, and they are helping them to conduct better research, monitoring and remediation. Now we will take examples of some particular wars. So firstly, we will talk about Syria. We won't talk what are the political reasons for this war, but we will try to discuss environmental issues after the Syrian war which is going on. So major environmental issues in Syria, they include deforestation, overgrazing, soil erosion, desertification, water pollution from the dumping of raw sewage and waste from the petroleum refining, and inadequate supplies of the potable water. Water shortages, exacerbated by population growth, industrial expansion, water pollution. These are significant long-term constraints on economic development. So the water shortages in Syria turned into 5 successive years of drought, prolonging of environmental issues that Syria already had. This outbreak of civil war in Syria has been detrimental to economy of the country, society, and your environmental life. The toxicity of weapons used during the war, such as mortar bombs were used, artillery shells, barrel bombs, aircraft bombs, etc. They lead to cause further damages to Syrian oil production, industrial areas, infrastructure, and waste management. Therefore, Ministry of Environmental Affairs in Syria, it has participated in United Nations conference to create the Sustainable Development Plan. So this plan was created as an effort to combat desertification, biodiversity and climate change. Unfortunately, General Assembly, it was declared that the plan had failed in terms of setbacks that were found within the degrading land and eroding development gains. These environmental issues are ultimately related to your Syrian war. So what is the effect of Syrian civil war? We'll discuss. Firstly, damage to the oil production. See, before talking about the effects, let me tell you one more thing. There were certain environmental issues prior to the Syrian war also. For example, there was a problem of water mismanagement. In the years 2006 to 11, Syria experienced 5 successive years of drought that created one of the biggest humanitarian crises Syria has ever known. It is natural for droughts to occur in countries with semi-arid climate. Another crisis was waste mismanagement. The waste mismanagement in Syria prior to the war was already hazardous and weak. There are 2 types of hazardous waste production in Syria, such as your industrial hazardous waste and medical hazardous waste. So domestic solid waste is also relatively collected by municipalities or private companies, but it was also reported to approximately 80% of domestic solid waste was disposed in open dump site. Their third problem before the war was mining pollution also. The phosphate industry has had negative impact on the environment. In fact, phosphate rocks have a high level of radioactivity. So the phosphate is exposed on the population and environment through mining and transportation of phosphate fertilizers. And these fertilizers in turn, they contained uranium, and also the waste mismanagement of phosphogypsum is being dumped in undesignated areas affecting the mining industry. So these problems were already there, and war created some new kind of problems. So now we'll talk about the effects. First is damage to oil production. ISIS took control of the oil refineries in Syria and has begun selling on the black market for less than oil would normally be sold. So it has become an economic incentive to purchase oil from ISIS, even if it means to fund a terrorist organization. Since September 2014, US, government of Syria, Russia and other allies have begun blowing up the oil refineries with airstrikes to cut off source of funding of ISIS. Because of this, ISIS has become desperate for oil. They began digging holes to find oil, and when found, lighting up the oil on fire to refine it. When the oil is released in the air, it released hazardous substances like your sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and lead. So these substances have long-term negative effects, such as there were respiratory disorders, liver problems, kidney disorders and cancers. The short-term effects can also affect soils, people and wildlife. Next effect was seen damage to industrial areas and infrastructure. The current civil war has had negative repercussion on Syria's infrastructure and industrial areas such as Homs, Hama, Damascus, Aleppo. The fight between ISIS and the Syrian army over Aleppo has affected its infrastructure, but also neighboring industrial zones such as Al-Sheikh Nazar. Since the outbreak, 52% of Aleppo's infrastructure has been destroyed or damaged. ISIS was occupying Damascus, affecting neighboring industrial cities, Adra, which host heavy industry facilities such as cement factories, chemical plants, oil, gas storage, military production sites, etc. Then another effect is toxicity of the weapons. The toxicity of weapons such as mortar bombs, shells, barrel bombs, missiles have taken a toll on environment and population's health. These weapons have ammunitions with common metal parts that contain your lead, copper, mercury, antimony, tungsten. So the missiles and rockets contain solid liquid propellants and nitroglycerine, nitroguanidine, nitrocellulose and dinitrotoluene. So each of them were very harmful for the environment. Then degradation of soil and vegetation took place. Vegetation degradation and soil erosion are among the greatest environmental impacts caused by Syrian civil war. The war has caused displacement of 13 million people, 8 million being internally displaced. Many of the internally displaced refugees have sought to avoid conflict by migrating to Syria's coastal region. The humid coastal region contains more than 90% of Syria's vegetation and is an important hotspot for biodiversity, carbon storage, timber and recreation in the country. Now there is vegetation loss also. Internal displacement has put immense pressure on the area's natural resources. First, much of civil war has taken place in fossil fuel rich areas, creating shortage of energy. The Syrian electricity network has also been targeted during the conflict. So those living in the coastal area are forced to cut down timber as fuel for heating and electricity. Second, the high influx of refugees has created need for more housing. So this need has caused the expansion of urban areas, encroaching on the dense vegetation and causing degradation. Third, the vegetation fires have been said to produce wood charcoal. The most intense vegetation loss has been in areas with dense vegetation cover. So as I mentioned earlier also, much of the fighting has occurred since fossil fuel extraction sites, specifically oil refineries. Attacks on oil refineries can cause oil fires which release harmful chemicals into the air such as sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, etc. So Syria also extracts heavy crude oil which generally has a higher proportion of noxious substances. There is the potential of these harmful substances to impact existing vegetation cover either aerially or by changing the soil chemistry. So next is your soil erosion. Soil erosion occurs when wind and water remove soil from an area. If the topsoil and organic nutrients are removed, the land will become like a desert and it will be difficult to support plant or animal life in a process known as desertification. So the soil resources in Syria coastal region were very fertile, however vulnerable to erosion. The consistent droughts relieved the occasional high intensity rain create ideal conditions for the erosion. So the area also has steep slopes which further the erosion risk. So soil degradation poses a threat to land productivity as it loses the organic matter and allows plant material to thrive. So this poses a risk not only to Syria's biodiversity but also to potential to rebound of the agricultural sector after the war. So the loss of vegetation cover in the coastal area is a factor that increases erosion. Plant roots help to keep soil in place as well as shield it from heavy rainfall and high winds. Plants also absorb excess water, slowing runoff and reducing risk of erosion. Therefore, we should plant more and more trees. But the rapid change in vegetation caused by the influx of refugees have created conditions for increased erosion in the Syrian region. In 2015, there was a dust storm in Syria also, Syria and Iraq. It is believed that this storm was caused by increased erosion in Syria due to civil war and the prolonged drought. So Syria's drought, which have inflamed the civil conflict as well as the mismanagement of Syrian water resources, resulted in a water shortage in Syria's agricultural region. The Turkish removal of dams along the Euphrates River may also have contributed to the water shortage. The intense bombing also stirred up the soil, contributing to soil erosion by making the soil easier to transport by wind and water. So you can see how harmful the effects of war could be on the natural resources. So Syria has seen worst of all. Now if we talk about the waste, solid waste management is also a problem it was a problem prior to Syrian civil war, but it is a problem after the war also. The conflict has caused a shutdown of government operated waste management services. This has led uncontrolled burning and dumping. Both of these have the potential to pollute the environment with airborne toxins or through chemicals seeping into the soil and groundwater. Now, as the war continues, poverty is increasing. More people are looking through the waste to find food, construction material, or items that can be sold. And then the municipal, medical, and hazardous waste are being mixed because of this collapse, which makes handling this waste especially very dangerous. The excess waste can also promote the spread of diseases and parasites throughout the country. People have started to create their own waste programs alongside those in place by UNDP and by Syrian Arab Red Crescent. Now we will talk a little bit about the environmental effect of the Gulf Wars. Now, firstly, giving you a brief information about the Gulf War, the Iran-Iraq War from September 1980 to August 1988 killed hundreds of thousands. In 1991, Iraq invaded Kuwait, claiming Kuwait was part of Iraq and that Kuwait stole oil from it. This Gulf War resulted in Operation Desert Storm, in which Saddam Hussein was defeated. This was a much smaller war and had an environmental impact. Then in April 2003, Allies conquered Iraq. This again was a much smaller war than the first one, but security degraded afterwards. The Gulf War also had an environmental impact. So now we will talk about the environmental impact of these small Gulf Wars. War often caused several environmental and human health effects. We all know that. Now talking about after the Gulf War, the absorption of air pollutant increased 705% in Baghdad, which is 887% more than World Health Organization recommendation. In addition, Kuwaiti oil fires caused a global problem and a hazard to human health. This smoke during these wars, it rose 1 to 4 kilometers high and blocked sunshine in the Kuwait region. This smoke reached UAE and Iran. Some countries such as Turkey, Syria, Afghanistan reported even the black rain. The behavior of Iraqi army has had a destructive effect on the soil of Persian Gulf region. Oil leaks from the fire wells, they were mixed with the gravel, resulted in a new layer of the surface of the desert called tarcrete. So this is the new layer that was formed with depth of 9 feet. All the plant life under these layers died and it impossible for the flora to grow again there. However, scientists suggest refraining from eliminating these layers because when removed, the dunes under the tarcrete will cause massive dunes to travel, destroying everything in their way. Next impact could be seen on the health. Cancer. According to some articles, the main reason of rising number of cancer and birth defects is depleted uranium and military weapons in Iraq. Official statistics show a sharp increase in the present age of cancer cases in Iraq. Then there are post-traumatic stress disorders. In 1995, incidents of post-traumatic stress disorder were high in Kuwait. Approximately 27% of Kuwaiti has this psychiatric disorder. 66% of those who were diagnosable post-traumatic disorder were still dreaming nightmares about some war events. In addition, many boys were dreaming different dreams about Saddam trying to kill them or hurt their families. A client documentary movie meets some affected families. A boy saw his father tortured, then killed by Iraqi soldiers. After this, the boy lost the ability to speak. Another affected victim has difficulty of speech because Iraqi soldiers forced her to watch her 2 sons killed by them. There were reproductive effects also. There was sharp increase in congenital defects and infertility. Cities now has the highest rate of genetic damage in a population at all. Many children now born with 2 heads, 1 eye, or problems in the nervous system. Scientists said that the rate is 14 times worse than Hiroshima also. Many scientists believe that depleted uranium is the main reason of appearing new diseases like new illness in the kidney, lungs, liver, total immune system collapse, etc. So here we can talk about the prevention and treatment. Persian Gulf countries cooperate to clean up the ruin and prevent future havoc. This section of the report will mention that has been cleaned up and the future prevention. The Royal Commission of Jubail has established a new program to monitor oil spill or any other chemical materials. In addition, it studies the possibility of oil leakage and how it can be stopped. So these are the preventive measures. So we all know that war has impact on environment. War and military activities have obvious detrimental impact on the environment. Weaponry, troop movements, landmines, creation and destruction of buildings, destruction of forest by defoliation or general military usage, poisoning of water sources, target shooting of animals for practice, consumption of endangered species out of desperation, etc. are just some of the examples of how both war and peacetime military activities harm the environment. Now talking about the law. From a legal standpoint, environmental protection during times of war and military activities is addressed partially by international environmental law. Further sources are also found in areas of law such as general international law, the laws of war, human rights law, and local laws of each affected country. However, we need to focus on the environment, and as soon as 2 countries are battling it out, the issue becomes one of the international concern. Thus, international environmental law and the United Nations Security Council enforces is the focus here. The law of armed conflict is not very well developed in the comparison to other areas of international law. Only United Nations Security Council has authority and the jurisdiction to regulate its development and implementation or to monitor its observance. There are various UN treaties also. These include 4th Geneva Convention, 1972 World Heritage Convention, 1977 Environmental Modification Convention. These have provisions to limit the environmental impacts of war or military activities. Now there is proposed 5th Geneva Convention also. Attempts have been made to get a specific Geneva Convention which should deal with protection of the environment during times of armed conflict, but so far this has not been successful. There are customary international laws also which has something to say about protection of environment during times of armed conflict and military activities. So under Rio Declaration, Principle 24 provides, states shall respect international law providing protection of environment in times of armed conflict and cooperate in its further development as necessary. Then there is UN General Assembly Resolution 47/37 which provides destruction of the environment not justified by military necessity and carried out wantonly is clearly contrary to existing international law. Now there are certain organizations also, the international organization with environmental mandates. They may be called upon during times of armed conflict to assist with mediating or remedying damage caused by armed conflict. Such agencies as UN Environment Programme, the World Health Organization, International Maritime Organization, they have relevance to protect the environment during the wartime or the peacetime from the military activities. So this is all about today's lecture. If you have any comments, you can comment in the comment section. Thank you.